Welcome to Allies or Enemies. I'm Jess.
And I am Shawn, and this is our top 100 favorite board games of all time. And this is it. We are finally here. We are counting down the top 10.
Yes, the final one. And before we did this, we each wrote down the 10 games we thought would be on the other person's list and the order. So we'll check back at the end for how close we actually get to it. But let's start off with your number 10.
My number 10 is Cascadia. And Cascadia is just such a tight design. This might be my favorite gateway game that's out there. And it's just all of the parts. I like everything about it. It's like a simple tile placement game, but also you've got these awesome little circular animal discs that feel really nice and clanky in a bag. And I love pulling stuff out of a bag that you're putting on top of those spaces. And then it's got this, the nice layer of the different scoring conditions, and that those are variable as well, which adds a lot of replayability to the game. And all of that stuff just makes it such a good gateway game. And we've played it so many times. And even with the simplicity of it, I've never gotten at all tired of this game.
Yeah, the layers of scoring are interesting, and I really like just trying to match up the landscape tiles and trying to, because whoever has the most gets a bonus. So you are trying to group the different landscapes. And so just that little bit of an extra decision of what tile you take for the landscapes with what animal does make it a bit tough, because sometimes you won't necessarily be able to get what you want.
The nice thing though is it's super rare that we just can't use one or the other. It almost never happens that we have to just throw away an animal because there's nowhere to put it. And I think it's nice too because that other layer of the little pine cones that you get for the keystone species, which Jess has a little song about that she says every single time she gets a keystone species. But that's a nice little addition as well that just helps you mess around with that market a little bit too. But just all of those little things put together, this is such a just terrifically tight package, and that is my number 10.
My number 10 is Gloomhaven, and we played through the Gloomhaven campaign a few years back now. And when we were playing it, I probably would have said it was my favorite game. Mm-hmm. We were playing it all of the time. We were staying up late because we thought, one more and we might be able to retire our characters. And we had so much fun really getting a character stronger and figuring them out and then moving on to the next one. And I think we got it at such a good time because we had just moved to the UK, so we didn't have a lot of games. And so having this one that we could play for months really fit, because we're well, what else are we going to do? Well, let's play Gloomhaven, and we were totally on board. But because it's been a few years, it's just naturally dropped down my list a little bit.
Yeah, I think it was really at the perfect time, because I remember when we got this, we were out in Bristol and we went into a board game store and we'd played games, but we weren't anywhere near this into games. And I was just what is your biggest box of game? What's your biggest, heaviest game that you have? And they just got it in. And I long for those days when we had space. For now we're what's your smallest game that we can get the most play out of? I would never say that now. But it was great because we just had this huge boxing game. We had room for it, and we dove in with both feet. And we really haven't been able to recreate that experience we've tried with the expansion. We tried with Jaws of the Lion, which is great, with Frosthaven, which just has, it's just a bit fiddly, I think. But Gloomhaven was just that perfect experience at the perfect time. And I'm so glad that we had it.
Yeah, and I was so excited for Frosthaven. I backed it as soon as it went up, and then we got it, and we have played it a fair number of times.
Yeah, I feel I want to say we haven't played it, then I look, and we've got 20 plays. It's 40 hours of Frosthaven. Yeah. So we've definitely put some time in.
But it's still such a small percentage of the game, and I think it's just tricky now that we have so many other games to find the time to play it. But Gloomhaven was just such an amazing experience that it is still my number 10.
My number 9 is Lost Ruins of Arnak. And when we started putting together the list, when we started making these videos, Lost Ruins was about 20-ish spots lower on my list. But between then and now, we got the latest expansion and oh boy, has that ever moved it up. I love when an expansion really changes the way that you can play a game. And it really works well that way as a co-op campaign game. Part of that is because Jess is just way better at the resource efficiency than I am. So you usually win this because you can get way up that track. And I'm like, how is that even possible? How did you do that? But now I can use that magic to my benefit because she's on my team and we're working together to fight against the puzzle. Also, all of the different sections of the campaign play like a little bit differently and have a new challenge, and that's been really cool to play with as well.
Yeah, for the expansion, for the campaign mode, each chapter has a challenge that drives you in a certain direction. So you might be really pushed to do the research track, and it makes that a whole lot harder, or to explore a lot of sites, or fight a lot of guardians. And it's been really interesting to try different ways of playing. Like, I never thought about really exploring lots of sites and not defeating those guardians. And now I'm like, oh, maybe I could do that. And I found with the base game, I was really stuck in a rut of playing a particular way of racing up the research track and defeating a couple of guardians.
And then winning the game.
And then winning the game. It did work for me. But it's been really interesting to see these different strategies. So I want to go back to the base game and try those.
While you're kind of learning these different things about, fighting the guardians and doing this other stuff over here, and maybe the research track isn't always the focus, I'm learning maybe I should focus on the research track and maybe I shouldn't just fight these guardians. And it also it really puts into your head like how many different paths and different things there are in this game, and the card play as well, which we didn't even talk about, how many things there are to explore. And that's fitting because it's an exploration game. And it is my number 9.
My number 9 is Tapestry, which is an abstracted civilization game, and I am always up for playing Tapestry. It helps that we have everything that you can possibly have for Tapestry. So that means we have a whole ton of different civilizations you can be, and it's asymmetric civilizations, so it makes a huge difference in how you play. And then you also have these city boards that you're trying to fill with these buildings as well. And some of the newer expansions have come with different versions of those too. So the mix and match between the civilizations and the city boards really feels like every time you're presented with a new challenge. And then on top of that, it's the tapestry cards that you get each time might drive you in certain directions as well. There are so many things that change how you shift your focus. And especially with the arts and architecture expansion, that added a whole 5th track too. So with that additional track, I find we're really trying different avenues more so than when it was just the 4 tracks.
Yeah, and the great thing about this game is the base system is so simple. Like the original rule book was, I think, 2 pages long. It was outrageous, maybe 4 pages long, that it was possible even to make a game that's like this big and is fairly heavy, to have it, to be able to condense the rules down that small says a lot about it, because it really is just kind of you exchange a resource, you move up a track. But all of those points of variability, the civilization, and those city boards are really cool, especially the new ones. And the latest expansion added a lot more fun, I think, too, because it's got all these little references to like horror movies or X-Men or a lot of stuff I personally really like. But it's all of these fun little references, and the city boards especially have that too.
Yeah, it's the fantasies and futures. And what is quite neat is because it's such an abstracted civilization game, it means that they were able to add in these science fiction references and these fantasy ones, because you aren't trying to recreate the path of humanity. It does let those auto references in a way that works really well. And that makes Tapestry my number 9.
My number 8 is Kanban. And I was just talking about how Cascadia is such a like beautifully simplified, like tight package. Kanban does kind of the same thing, but for a much, much, much heavier game. This is just, for a heavy game, this system is so sleek and so smooth, and that's why it's my favorite of Lacerda's games. You've got every single part of it is so completely intertwined with every other part of it. But the nice thing is you can start at any point within the system, and it will work as long as you are also going to those other points before too long. But it means that you can't get like fully blocked. You can just be slightly less efficient.
Yeah, and it is good that you can visit the places out of order, because even at a two-player game, it feels really tight because Sandra moves along and you can never go where Sandra is. And so far, we've only played with nice Sandra because I've been too worried about playing with mean Sandra. Nice Sandra will reward the person who's doing best, but mean Sandra will punish the person who's doing the worst. And I don't know if I'm ready for that yet.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to use though, because nice Sandra feels mean because she's very judgmental. But mean Sandra, knowing that I'm gonna have to have at least this much of whatever the thing is, really that would be an interesting challenge. I think we've played this enough now that we should probably take that on. And another cool thing about this too is just how it uses time as a resource as well. I don't know a lot of games that do that, especially as well as this does that. And so this is my number 8.
My number 8 is Horrified, which is a gateway cooperative game with an amazing theme. I'm going specifically with the Universal Monsters one, although I do like both. But we watched all of the Universal Monster movies when we got the game, which I had never seen before. We love Halloween, so anytime it's gearing up towards Halloween, we play a whole lot of Horrified. And so this is a game we can play again and again. It helps that there's slight asymmetric player powers, but also the monsters, you can introduce a different number of monsters, and they all play slightly differently. And because it is so simple, it's a good game to introduce to new players. When we were up at AirCon, we had won the American Monsters one, and that was the first time we put up a little like, come play with us sign. Mm-hmm. And we had strangers play with us. And I think that's also part of why I like this game so much, is just that memory of bringing strangers and playing with them for the first time.
Well, and that's scary the first time that you do it. And it went really well. And we ended up playing like the whole night with all different people. And I like the American Monsters because of the 50s diner style of it, the feel of it. And then it's got just slightly more complex, slightly different monsters. And I'm really interested to see the new one. But I definitely agree, Universal Monsters, that has like my heart, because I love those movies so much. Bride of Frankenstein especially. If you haven't seen that, that is my favorite of the Universal monster movies.
And they do such a great job of incorporating all of the worlds onto one board, because they have each of the different monsters' locations, but it still feels like one town. And when you open up the box and you see the board with like, ooh, watch out, this will be scary.
So many great little details.
And it's those details that I love, and that makes Horrified my number 8.
My number 7 is Planet Unknown, and this is the newest game to make it into my top 10. This one just came out last year, and this has everything that I like. This has tile placement, this has tracks, and really interesting tracks that are like comboing and letting you bump things up. And this has got just a whole bunch of asymmetry, because it has the asymmetric corporations and it has asymmetric planets. And those two things together combine in all sorts of interesting ways. And we know, because we've played with most of those combinations now. We've played this game so much. This is broken into like our top 10 most played like of all time games. And we've only owned it for like a year. Because this is also one that I just want to introduce to anyone that comes over. Part of that is because it looks so great on the table, but also because everyone is always involved. And I really like that. And a lot of games have everyone always involved. But on this, it feels like it's always your turn. And it's got a fun little like centerpiece as well that just adds to it even more.
Yeah, the lazy season really is the star of the show because of that choice. When it's your turn, you can choose any option. And then the other people, they still get a choice too, which is nice, because when your arrow's pointing at one of them, you get to choose out of 2 options. And one option is a bigger tile, one's a smaller tile. But you're often trying to decide which tracks you want to go up. So that will influence your decision, which makes it a bit tricky because the game ends when somebody can't place a tile. Mm-hmm. So often you'll be choosing the bigger tiles just to try and fill up your planet more. but sometimes those small little like 2 tiles might be just the things you need. So it's that continual compromise of, do I want to go up the right tracks, or do I really want to make sure I'm filling up my planet?
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of the kind of hidden interaction comes in too. Because when we play at 2 players, we both want to get like everything just perfect. So both of us tend to take those smaller pieces, and we have a lot more pieces, and we take a little bit longer. But when you play with a lot of players, someone is always going to go for those big pieces and pushing. And the more people you've got to mess with that pace, kind of the more interesting this game is too. And it is my number 7.
My number 7 is another game about terraforming planets, but this one specifically is terraforming Mars. And we got Terraforming Mars again pretty early in our collection, and it has stayed with me. I love the tableau building. You end up with so many different cards, and all of that changes your engine. And because it comes with like just an absurd amount of cards, each game is going to be totally different. So you just have to play what you think is best dependent on what you have. You really can't plan towards certain things because you just may not get those cards. And what keeps it interesting too is the asymmetry. We like asymmetry a lot, and this is another example of just those starting corporations trying to gear you in certain directions, but you might end up going a completely different way based on the engine that you're building as well. So I love the theme, I love the tableau building, and I love just the actual transformation of the red planet into something that seems livable.
Yeah, I think having that central board where we're putting the stuff on, especially because we got the fancy 3D tiles too, is really fun. But I 100% agree that like there's been games where I've thought at the start, oh yeah, I'm going to do this sort of thing, and then I look at my starting cards and I think, well, okay, I'll do that later, but right now I'll use like these 3 like greenery focused cards. And that just, now I'm doing a greenery thing. I'm not doing whatever I thought I was going to do. You really do just need to use what you've got and then build with what you've already built. And that's just going to kind of take you down a path. And I think all of the different paths that are possible in this just make that so interesting.
Yeah, and at 2 players, the other thing that's guiding you as well are the awards and the milestones, because we do find that we achieve them all between the 2 of us, but I'll stay away from the ones that I know you're going to win so I can focus on the other ones. So that's interesting as well in terms of that, trying to decide which ones based on what you have you think you can achieve. And all of it together makes Terraforming Mars my number 7.
My number 6 is A Feast for Odin. And talking about a game that has a lot of different paths, this one has just the most different paths. This feels like just an enormous sandbox of possibilities, especially for a worker placement game, although this does famously have like the most worker placement spots ever. There are so many spaces, and they're all interesting though, and they're all usable, and they're all useful in their different ways, and it's so neat to have a game that goes in so many paths, and that we're learning how to play so much better all of the time. Because at first we were I just got to fill this starting board, and it's so hard. How am I going to fill this starting board? And then I saw on another channel someone was talking about, and I wish I could remember who it was, but someone was talking about that you got to get the islands first. That's so important. And I thought, how would you even ever do the islands? And then I got them. And I realized, oh, this is how you fill the other board, is you get these things over here on the islands and the longhouses, and then you build an engine. Like, oh, that's really interesting. And then someone else was like, oh, you got to get the cards. And then it was like, oh, and these cards get me bonuses well, they're attached to other spaces, and that gets me things. And so it's these layers that I just keep finding, even after so many plays, and keep learning how to play this game better and better. So I just feel like myself progressing and getting smarter at this. It really is a fascinating game.
And what really helped me as well was the Norwegian expansion. And it did it for a few reasons. One of the reasons is it really made you use those cards more because it had a few more spaces that let you pick up cards and play cards. And I did find that playing those cards pushed me in other directions that I hadn't thought about trying before. And the other thing it does is it really gives you a great option for when you only have your last one or two workers. Because sometimes before you'd be like, oh, I only have one worker left. This feels a little bit like a wasted action to go here. Now, those actions feel almost the strongest, which is really interesting that you're always left with something great to choose from at the very end of the round.
Yeah, and I think Norwegian expansions is great no matter what player count, but it's like a must at 2 players because it tightens up that board just a little bit at 2 players, and it really changes the game. And I think I've liked the game already, but it has made it way better. And that is my number 6.
My number 6 is Barren Park, which is by Phil Walker Harding. And I think this was the first Phil Walker Harding game we played, and we loved it. And ever since then, we play so many of his games, and we really like them. But this is still my favorite of his games. I love the theme of building a bear park, and you get to just cover your board and take different tiles depending on what you're covering. But the whole thing involved as well is a race, because it's a race towards the goals, it's a race towards filling up a board to get the higher value bear statues, and it's a race towards getting the different types of bears because their value decreases as they disappear.
There's something about this game that I just find so charming. I think maybe it's just that it just is like tile placement with more layers of tile placement. This is like if Exhibit found out that you liked a tile placement game. That's what this is. And it just does it so well.
And it's timed really well that most people almost get to finish their board or finish it, which is great. So even if you don't score well, you're like, oh, look, I've managed to fill my entire board. Then you count up your points and you realize you got a lot of low value things, and that's where you try and do better next time. But it is nice still to feel a sense of completion. And that makes Barren Park my number 6.
My number 5 is Everdell. And Everdell, first off, is just beautiful. And that's what originally drew us to this. And I think we've been talking a lot about like board game first, but this was the first time that the two of us, at least in the UK, had gone to a board game cafe. And we went to one out in Bristol, and we saw this game on the shelf, and we were just like, we got to play this later. And because of that, it was the first time we watched a how to play video, and Rodney Smith taught us how to play that on the video, because we just went back to the hotel. We had like an hour to wait, and learned the game, and came back very excitedly and set it up with its big, beautiful tree, which now I hate so much. It's so in the way. But we set up that tree, and we played it, and it just knocked our socks off. We both just loved it. And that's never gone away. We keep on being like enjoying this game, being invested in this game. And I think the big box that came out this year, the complete collection, is why this has stayed at the same spot, I think, that it was last year, even though there's all these other great games that have come out or that we've played, because it just gives so many new ways to play it as well. And I think New Leaf, which just came in the big box, is maybe the best expansion.
Yeah, I would agree. It makes building higher value things easier, which is nice too if you're struggling to build something that costs a whole lot of resources. And it adds additional goals in terms of the passengers on the train, which is great because we've played a lot of Everdell that we have gotten to the point where we do have a lot of resources or things left over at the end. So those passenger goals really tap into that and gear you towards being able to use those possibly to score points. So New Leaf definitely introduced a few key things. It didn't change the game like some of the other expansions that we've talked about, but instead it enhanced the base game to make it even better.
And another thing that the complete collection did that has just made me love this game even more is it gave us all of the critters. And we had some of the expansions before, but we didn't have the collector's edition. So we were missing a bunch of the really like the platypus and the axolotls and some like specifically fantastic animals, and now having all of them and having those stickers on them too, which I wasn't sure I even wanted to use, but I'm glad you talked me into it because it adds so much personality that it just makes a super charming game even more charming. And that is my number 5.
My number 5 is Lost Ruins of Arnak, and unlike you, this has stayed the same position. I love the expansion, but it was already ranked highly for me. And I think a huge reason why is the puzzle of just trying to do everything that you need to do with what feels like very limited opportunities because you only have 2 workers and there's only 5 rounds, meaning you're only placing workers out 10 times. But you're able to get other resources through other avenues. There's so many different combos you can do. Cards come into it a huge amount. And when we realized that buying items was so important, we started buying a whole lot more. Climbing up the research track, you do have to spend resources, but it also gives you resources. Exploring sites costs you resources, but gives you resources. So it's such a great combination of having to spend things, but get things at almost an equal rate, but it might not be quite the right things. So just trying to figure out how you can turn one thing into another keeps that puzzle really interesting.
Yeah, this is a really, really tight puzzle. You always have to think kind of 3 moves ahead of, if I move here, then this will move me up the track, but then this will do this. And then if I play this card, I can buy this other card, and then that will do this. And then when that plan comes together, you just feel so clever.
You do, because it feels impossible at the beginning. It feels impossible to explore lots of sites, to defeat lots of guardians, to go up the track. But it does come together, but in a way that leaves you with that feeling of like, woo, look at how I managed to do this. And so the base game and the expansions that added the asymmetric player powers definitely helped as well. And of course, the campaign, which I really love, makes Lost Ruins of Arnak my number 5.
My number 4 is Anachrony, and Anachrony is a fairly heavy game. On BGG, I know it's got quite a heavy rating. It's like a 4 or something. And I don't think it is as heavy as people think, or at least it's not rules heavy, because this is a game that we've played a bunch of times, but we only play kind of every few months because it is a bit of a longer experience. And we almost never have to look at the rule book again. It's a fairly simple rule set, but that heaviness comes from just a lot of fun, interesting, like chunky decisions that you're making all of the time because you don't have nearly enough workers for anything, and you certainly don't have enough mechs. And so you've got to be thinking about, how do I get the things to charge up my mechs, because the mechs are the only way you can go to the shared planet, and you go there by putting them really amazingly, slotting them into the mechs, which is one of my favorite experiences in board games. But you need enough that you can go out there, but you also need enough water to actually wake up your workers so you can use them. The game just has these really great kind of checks and balances for all of the things that you need to do. So you're kind of forced in a lot of games where there's like a feeding part. There's all of these different kind of feeding barriers in this game, but they're all more interesting, I think.
And you are right. I've never thought about Anachrony, the barriers being like the feeding mechanic, but it definitely is. And just like that, you really have to set yourself up for the next turn. Because I found myself like being like, oh, I can do so much. This is amazing. And then realizing, oh no, next time I can only put out 1 mech because I forgot to get the stuff that I need to be able to put out more mechs. And you do have to spend a lot to keep your workers awake, but it does give you the option of forcing them awake.
Right, yeah,
so
which is great.
Which is great, because if you're in a pickle and you're like, oh no, well, I definitely need workers or else I'm hooped, then you can force them awake and still get them. You'll just end up with more negative points at the end.
Yeah, and another thing that has changed this a bit too is the expansions. We've been talking a lot about the expansions, but in Anachrony, a lot of these expansions are really interesting. But I almost feel like we have too many choices, and we found ourselves just going back to the base game a lot more. But just as a base game experience, that's all you're going to need for this for at least like 20-ish plays. And that is my number 4.
My number 4 is Dwarf Romantic, and this is the highest ranked, newest game on my list. It is a cooperative tile placement game. I love both of those mechanics, and it smushes them together so perfectly. It's so chill. We had this on our top 10 comfort games for exactly that reason. I think it's a little bit like if I were to do jigsaw puzzles, which I never really got into, but that same sense of like calmness as you're piecing it all together. And I really like us playing it together because it's so collaborative. Every time we pick up a tile, it's a discussion of where the tile can go, and then you don't lose, but you always try and get more and more points. And I think that's one of the reasons why I don't like jigsaw puzzles, is because you don't get any points. So you get this similar kind of feeling, but with points, and you're doing it together.
Dwarf Romantic is just a really cozy, comfy puzzle. And I think in our review of it, I compared it to, it's like the board game version of drinking hot chocolate on like a chilly day. And that's 100% what this is. It's just so cozy. It's like the mittens of board games. And we enjoy it every time we play it. We enjoy it the whole time we play it. And even if we're losing, which you can't really do, you just don't win as well. But even if things aren't going well, it's always joyful.
Yeah, it's a great game to play if I'm feeling really stressed or I just want something to feel a little bit better. I remember it was one of my games of choice on my birthday because we have a rule that we can play whatever the other person wants on their birthday. And I was like, Dwarf Romantic, because you're up for playing it. But if it was up to me, we would play it.
It's all we would play.
It's all we would play. We would play it every single day. So you're quite good at playing it with me. And I do understand we can't play it all the time. But it is my number 4.
My number 3 is Ultimate Railroads. And all 3 of my top 3 games have been my number 1 game at some point in the last week. I have bounced back and forth on this so much. I almost switched them right now as well, but I'm holding to it. And Ultimate Railroads is going to be my number 3, but Ultimate Railroads is an absolutely fantastic game. And this is a track game. This is a track bumping worker placement game. But the tracks in we've had a few of these that we've talked about, games where it looks like it's going to be impossible and then you can't believe how much you've done at the end. And I think it's such a skill to be able to have a game that has that sort of arc to it. And this one is that, like, to the extreme, because your first turn you get like 8, 10, maybe 12 points if you really kill it. On your last turn, you're maybe scoring like 120 points because of all the stuff that you've built up. But as you get those bonuses and you get more workers and you unlock things and you put things on top of your board, it's so satisfying, and it's so addictive. And that there are 4 different kinds of railroads in this, plus a bunch of modules, and all of that stuff plays differently. This is just like this box of board gaming joy to me.
Yeah, you're always debating which track to go down, and often it's a debate of, ooh, I can get 5 points now, or I can get this bonus now, or you can get a little like plus to each round scoring, and those can pay off at the end. So we've had games where one person has gone like way ahead in the first couple rounds, but because the other person has worked towards getting all of those bonuses that will eventually build and build, they've managed to like lap them by the end of the game.
This is one of those very few games that, like, I played it, I think, on BGA first, and I was just like, holy cow, you gotta play this game. Like, it blew me all the way away. Like, I think I ordered this game before I'd even finished that first game on BGA, and I got creamed in that first game. I just got fully destroyed, and I could not have loved it more. And then when we got it, I just love it even more on the table when we're actually playing it and I can see all of the things. If you haven't played it, you got to play this. It is my number 3.
My number 3 is Ark Nova. And Ark Nova is such a great mix of what a lot of games have done well. So it is a Frankenstein of mechanics, or a Frankenstein monster, if you will, of mechanics.
Yes.
Because it has the Civilization, New Dawn action selection system. It has the Rajas of the Ganges, of the 2 tracks crossing to trigger the end of the game. And then it feels a little bit like Terraforming Mars in terms of the tableau building and the icons that you're trying to mix and match as well. And I love all 3 of those things. So together, it makes for a really interesting game. I also really like the theme. I have a background in zoology, so doing a conservation zoo is great. And I really like that you're building out your zoo, but a key part of what you're doing is then the conservation efforts of trying to release them. Mm-hmm. The tricky is, I love primates. So I always, anytime there's a primate, I always want to get a primate, even though it might not tie into anything else I'm doing. So there is a draw of like just getting the cards I want that has to be mitigated a little bit with what cards will make me do better.
Yeah, I really like that about this game too, because I feel like I am usually the one who's guilty of that. Often in games, Jess will see like the solid path forward and kind of how the math works for the game. And I will be like, building castles is fun, I'm gonna build more castles, and then I will lose because she's better at the math side. And this is one where I am better at the actual math side of it, and I can kind of take myself out of it a bit. And you are just like, oh my goodness, apes, I gotta get them. Oh, look, it's vervet monkeys, I gotta get them. And it's like every kind of primate. She's just got a full primate zoo every time. And that really works to my benefit, so I really do appreciate that. But it's also fun just watching you, like, really loving every time you pull any sort of primate card. You can tell when she does the card draw and which one she's got. It's just like, oh, and it's like, oh, I see what has happened here.
So I still really enjoy it, even if I'm not playing it to the best of my ability. But we have gotten better and better at this game, because at first I think it surprised us when the end came, when the two markers crossed, so we only had like maybe a couple points, but now we really set ourselves up for a really big last round, and that makes Arc Nova my number 3.
My number 2 is Dune Imperium. And Dune Imperium I really liked right out of the gate. I thought it was just an absolutely terrific. It just felt so Dune. It's so tight in that only going up to 10 points, and like the war of attrition kind of that's going on in the middle, and like knowing when to take back your troops, and the tight deck building, card playing element, all the politics, all of that stuff I really like. But with the expansions, I feel like with both expansions, that is kind of the full game of Dune. It feels like that's how Dune was built, and then they kind of started off with a simpler version, which wasn't that simple, but then have added these layers, and all of the layers really, really make this shine. The first one did a great job of just fixing a couple of the spaces that didn't feel that interesting, and then adding a few different ways to play. But then the second one, I feel like with all of the extra cards and the extra card play mechanics, as well as another board that you're moving up with the research, there's so many paths, and there's so much to explore in this game, but to explore in this really like slow, sloggy, but like really terrifically sloggy, Duneful way.
And I think what again helps with this game is the asymmetric factions, because there are so many different factions you can play, and it's small little powers, but in a game that's so tight, all of those little powers do make a difference in how the game feels and the different directions that you're playing as well. And so we've played a lot because we always want to play all the characters that we can possibly play.
Yeah, and there are like 25 characters, and there's some silly amount of different characters. But I like that. I like the like rich world building, and this is a world that I'm so interested in too. And that is my number 2.
My number 2 is Cascadia, and this was already mentioned on your list, but I also love Cascadia, obviously because it's my number 2. I think part of my love definitely comes from the fact that I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so I love that I'm building out that landscape with the animals that I'm so familiar with, and there's so many games that we enjoy that you're left feeling rewarded by having built something that you can look down on at the end. And Cascadia does that so well with all of the landscapes and getting it populated with the animals. And so even if I don't win, I still just really have enjoyed building my Pacific Northwest region.
Yeah, it's such a great game. And that theme does help a lot, because I wasn't quite in the Pacific Northwest, but I was like just next door to that. No one's making a prairies. Building out the prairies, you're just putting yellow or slightly off yellow. So I really do appreciate like the theme and the familiarity of this game. I think that makes it feel like a little bit of home. But then we just play this over and over and over. You can play this like 3 times in a night and it still feels fresh and interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's partly why it is number 2. I mean, almost all my games on my top 10, I guess Gloomhaven not so much, but the rest I do want to play anytime. I'm always up for playing, but it's particularly true for Cascadia. I do wonder if it would be so high if we still lived out there.
Right. If we could just look out, oh, look, it's Cascadia right now.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like maybe it is also high because it is a little part of where I grew up, which is so different to here. And it makes Cascadia my number 2.
My number one is Gaia Project, and that is still holding tight from last year. Although last year it was like number one with a bullet. This year, this was like a game time decision. This was so tight between those top three. But what it just holds on is I think it does a lot of the same things that I love about those all of the other games in my top five. Really, it's the asymmetry, the different paths to victory, the tightness of resources. But there's something about this one that just does it just a little bit better, where those different paths can feel so different, especially with the tech tree. And those different factions can feel so different, where some of them you're really just focusing on that main board and building where you're building all of your different houses and traveling to the different planets. And sometimes it's really just that tech tree, and that tightness is so unbelievably tight. It's not that like I don't see where I'm going to go at like the end of the game. I don't see where I'm going to go like my next action. And every action, I'm like, oh, how was that possible? Okay, how am I going to do the next thing? Oh, I could do it this way. Okay, cool. Now how am I going to do the next thing? It's like a constant thing. And I could see if you played this with someone with AP, or even playing with this with like a lot of players, it may not be as high on your list. But at two players, which is absolutely where this shines, this is like two-player Terra Mystica, really. And at two players, this is just, it's just perfect.
I do agree about the possibility for analysis paralysis. I don't really find that in our games because both of us are so focused all of the time that I have no idea how long you're taking on your turn.
I think we just both have AP all the time.
Yeah.
Because you're so in it. You just don't, like, I'm never like, oh, I'm waiting for your turn.
Exactly. I'm almost glad when you take a while because if I'm taking just as long figuring out my turn, and then same thing, when it gets to me, you're immediately trying to figure out what you're doing next, that you don't notice how long I'm taking. And so it is a full brain burner. 100% of my attention is focused on this game, which is great. It's a really interesting puzzle to solve.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you were saying that, I was thinking this sounds like a negative, but it's not. Like, and I 100% agree with you, but it's in like the most positive way. And I just find this game so completely engaging, and that is why it is my number one.
My number one is Everdell, and I don't think that comes as a surprise to you. It's been my number one ever since we started doing these lists, and it has held strong. And I think there are a few reasons for it. One reason is, like you mentioned, we played it pretty early in building our board game collection here in the UK. And for me, prior to playing this, I was like, yeah, I love board games, but I'd primarily played a lot of gateway games. So things like Ticket to Ride and Betrayal on House on the Hill and Catan and Carcassonne. And then when we played Everdell, everything about it was so pleasant. It looked amazing, the resources were so lovely, but the gameplay as well, we were getting in each other's way in terms of where we want to go, but I wasn't like targeting you and it wasn't mean towards you. And I was building something beautiful and lovely and you weren't really gonna mess with it. And I think that was one of the first times that I thought, this is what board games can be, and it really made me want to explore more. So I love Everdell. I love the mechanics and the build-up. Like the first season, you only get a few workers, so each season you get stronger and stronger with more workers and more cards. It's just continually positively rewarding. Like it gets more rewarding the more in the game you go, and the whole game overall was such a new experience for me that it what pushed me into exploring more board games.
Yeah, I wonder how I would feel about this if not for you, because you are so delighted by it that I want to play it just because then you're like, oh, we get to play Everdell. I'm so happy about it. And I do really love this game though. And I think you're probably a big part of that. But I think even outside of that, I would still like this game because at its base, it's just a really interesting resource management game. It helps that all those resources are terrific and it's got squishy berries and nice sticks and smooth rocks. And that does add to it. But the resource management is interesting. And then the card tableau building is interesting.
Yeah, I love all the components, the actual components, and then the mechanics of building out my tableau. Again, it is something that afterwards I look down and I'm like, ooh, look at my little village, even
Hmm.
if I don't win. So I think it'll be really hard to displace this game because of what it did to bring me into the hobby and the fondness that I think I'll always feel for it, that I hope I always feel for it. And that makes Everdell my number one.
And that is it. Thank you so much for doing this giant, crazy journey with us. This was a lot of work. Every year we forget how much work it is, but we really appreciate it because we see how many people actually watch this and share this and like this and everything else. And that does mean a lot in all the comments and everything else. And it is fun to do this whole giant countdown and kind of check back in with where it is. And quite a bit has changed.
Yeah, I do feel like we do this primarily for ourselves because we're just curious of
We're just being selfish.
like where are our games now, and it gives us this record to look back on year upon year. And so at the beginning I said that we made a list of our top 10. Now we did it after our last video. I feel like if we had made this list at the very
We
beginning,
should do that next year, yeah.
yeah, that it would look quite a bit different because by then I knew basically what games would be in it, but what order it was, I wasn't too sure. So how did you do with guessing mine?
I got all of the games, but I managed only two correct, and I feel like Everdell was such a gimme. So I only had one other one, so 2 out of 10. So between that and that I said we would have 4 direct crossovers, and we had none, not one direct crossover in the whole thing, I have failed a lot.
For yours, I managed to get 3 in the correct position. And again, I did get the right games, but only 3 were right. And that was because I did like a last minute switch between 2 and I called it. And I had guessed 2 direct crossovers. We had none, but I was closer.
That's
so
true.
I feel
Yes,
like
2 is
overall,
closer to 0. Yep.
I won with that. But thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Thank you for watching just this one, if this is the only one you watched, or thank you for watching some of the other ones, if you watched those too. As usual, please let us know in the comments if you've played any of these games. Please like, subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time for another game.